You're good to go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this session of Entering Harvard with special guest, Ms. Tamara Lanier and her daughter, Shonrael. We are so excited to have them. We also have panelist Jarrett Drake, who is an organizer with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign and a lawsuit plaintiff in suing Harvard. I am also a plaintiff in our lawsuit against Harvard. Just so everyone knows, the theme of tonight will be why we sued Harvard. And there's 2 lawsuits right now. I will let Ms. Lanier talk more about hers, but to give a little bit of background, my name's Amanda Chan, and I'm part of the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, which is a student group at Harvard, an unofficial one, that seeks to sever the university's ties from all forms of policing and the carceral state. So currently, Harvard's $40 billion endowment is invested in the prison industrial complex, both in the actual private prisons and in many companies which service the needs of prisoners inside of prisons in the first place. So Harvard is profiting off of the systematic caging and torture of Black and brown people, and we think that's wrong. So we came up with a legal theory and we sued Harvard about it. But I'm really excited to hear what the others have to say. Please keep in mind that this session is both being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. So if you don't catch something, you can totally re-watch later to catch it again. And if you don't want to be on the record, then you can just turn your video camera off, and then you shouldn't be in the recording whatsoever. So we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll try to get them to them if we have any time. I do ask that everyone be respectful. If there are any right-wing trolls here, you are not welcome. But everyone else, this is a space of learning, this is a space of growth, and this is to learn all about the amazing work that people are doing every single day to make this country or this world a more liberated world. So with that, I will pass it to Jarrett, which, I mean, if you can tell us a little bit about the background you chose tonight too. I know you were talking a little about it before. That would be really interesting to hear, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Peace, everybody. My name is Jarrett, and I'm one of the organizers with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. I'm a PhD student in anthropology, where I focus on doing abolitionist research projects, honestly. So my background, in addition to not wanting y'all to see where I live, I also chose this virtual background for a very particular reason. And the reason is that this is an illustration of the seizure of the Amistad, the slave ship that, one of many slave ships that was bringing enslaved Africans, kidnapped Africans, into a life of slavery. And the people on board the ship, if you don't know the story, said absolutely not. You know, led to, so this actually, Tamara and I were talking about this a little bit beforehand. So that's kind of the overview, and it has some local resonance as well. So I'll pass it to Tamara to talk more about sort of the history with Connecticut and everything.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jared, and thank you, Amanda. I am extremely honored to be a part of this conversation tonight. And when I first came on and I saw Jared's background, I was like, wow. And because, you know, we talked briefly about the history of the Amistad, it landing, though much of the history is told from a New Haven, Connecticut perspective. Its origins began here in London, Connecticut. So just, you know, an opportunity for truth telling, which is kind of what we're here to speak on tonight, truth telling and truth and reconciliation, and just having an honest discussion and debate about slavery in the United States and its evolution in the United States, from slavery to Black codes to convict leasing to peonage to Jim Crow to sharecropping to mass incarceration to where we are today. Slavery never ended, it evolved. And we will talk about, the purpose of this call is to talk about Harvard's role from slavery to where we are today in their exploitation of Black bodies. So, again, for me, the most important part of anything I do is truth telling and making sure that there's an awareness about the true history of what happened and not the false narratives that we have been taught as children.
And Shonrael, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shonrael Lanier. Tamara Lanier is my mother. And we are here. I'm here just in support of this movement and holding Harvard accountable. I think that if there was any time, now is the time. If there was ever a place to have this discussion, I think that this is a great opportunity to have this discussion now about how we need to hold not only Harvard, but our entire country, our entire nation, our legislative bodies accountable for perpetuating this continued enslavement of Black people and exploitation of Black bodies.
Thank you so much for those introductions, everyone. So my first question, just to make sure that the audience does have a clear understanding of what's going on and what type of challenges we're bringing to Harvard. Ms. Lanier, do you want to give a summary of your lawsuit against Harvard right now that's pending? And I'll share that photo that you shared with me.
Bringing this action against Harvard was certainly not my choice, in that I looked for other options long in advance of filing this complaint. We're talking about a 10-year process where I have reached out to Harvard only to be rejected. And I think that that's a fair assessment, because initially when I made the discovery, Harvard was quoted to say, there's no way that I could prove that I'm a lineal descendant of Renty. When press would reach out to Harvard for comments, they would say, that they are the ethical stewards of this property. And that, there was no attempt to come to the table, not only to discuss the concerns that I was raising, but to even hear what I had to say. They were very dismissive from the door to this moment. They have been dismissive. And basically, my reasoning for pressing Harvard was, I challenged them, firstly, look at my research and tell me definitively whether you agree or disagree that I'm a lineal descendant of Renty. And so I got no response from them. If I did get a response, it was a very pleasant, dismissive response, where it was virtually a non-responsive response, ignoring my questions, ignoring the point of the emails or the communication, and just simply being dismissive. And so I felt challenged by Harvard, because every time they would speak in the press, they would say there's no way she can prove this, that she is not a linear descendant of Renty. And so I was motivated not only to prove this, I knew in my heart what I was saying was true, but now I had to find the documents to prove that. So from 2010 to where we are today, I have been on a journey of trying to definitively pinpoint that Renty is my great-great-grandfather. And I was able to do that through oral history, through census information, through death records, through cemetery records. I can put my family on the land that was owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And throughout that journey, each time there was additional pieces of information, there were news stories where they reached out to Harvard for a comment, and always it was something dismissive and something to insult the dignity and legacy of Renty. One of the things that was so troubling about this entire journey was not only how the images came to be, but the fact that they were used as propaganda by Harvard and other political people in the Boston area to promote slavery, first of all. And then second of all, and most troubling, was it was the justification for slavery, a scientific justification of inferiority. And this was Harvard-sponsored science that was promoting at a time when this country was divided between emancipation and slavery. Harvard had its thumb on the scale and used their scientific and academic prowess to promote slavery and to give it justification. And there are historians who write about the fact that when Harvard entered the race, so to speak, there is a politician who was quoted to say, the race is in the bag because Harvard is now a part of the discussion about promoting slavery and justifying that people of color, that Black people at that time were subhuman. And so when I, initially started reaching out to Harvard, I knew about the race science, but I didn't know the extent of the implications of what Harvard had done. Louis Agassiz has been described as the father of apartheid. He has been described as the father of scientific racism. He has been described as the father of the eugenics movement. He has been described as the father of medical apartheid, where people of color, where Black men and women were used as scientific experiments because Louis Agassiz had planted the seed that Blacks don't feel pain in the way that white people do. So Harvard, again, was the de facto sponsor of this reign of terror. And what they were doing was any attempt to speak ill of Louis Agassiz, they would stifle that. They would, there were groups who wanted to use the images to talk about Louis Agassiz and the impact not only on people in this country, but people all over the world. And Harvard would deny them access. And they actually put in writing, because you plan to speak ill, and I'm paraphrasing, but they actually said, because you plan to speak ill of Louis Agassiz, we're not going to allow you to use the images. And so in dealing with groups who were supportive of Louis Agassiz or who didn't plan to speak in a way of truth-telling about Louis Agassiz and his impact on the history of slavery in this country and the subjugation of people all over the world, Harvard would allow them to have access to the images. But if you plan to have an exercise in truth-telling and about true history of Harvard's role in it, they wouldn't much use the image. So I began to question early on Harvard's response to me, because when my story was shared, other people, again, from all over the world were amazed. Some people referred to the, the work done and just the impossibility of the story and making those connections as the next roots, a great American story. I heard from other universities. I spoke at Yale, and I'm speaking at other places sharing my story. And every single time that I reached out to Harvard, they shut the door in my face. So I'm like, this does not make sense to me. Why is Harvard not as excited as everybody else about this amazing development? And, and I had help along the way. I had a lot of help from a number of different people. But, in terms of my interactions with Harvard, the president, Drew Faust, it was offensive in that one of the things that I would often say to them is, tell the truth about who Renty is. Allow him his dignity. Return his dignity to him by saying, this is not the man that is portrayed in the propaganda that Louis Agassiz used to promote slavery in the 1850s. This man was an educator. He was literate. He taught people to read. He read from the Bible. He was a Bible teacher. He was a community. Tell who he really was. You know, that small measure, that small gesture can go a long way in atoning for what you have done in the past to disparage this person. Tell his truth. And absolutely no takers from Harvard. No one was interested in telling or promoting his true story. They promoted Louis Agassiz's lies about race science and blacks being separate and lesser species. And so at the point when I definitively knew that there was beyond any question of doubt that Renty was my grandfather, you know, and again, after attempts to reach out to Harvard, that's when I started talking to attorneys, just saying, you know what, they are just completely indifferent to hearing the truth, to telling the truth, and there must be some legal redress that I could have. Now imagine, we're talking about a 200-year-old case, and the kinds of precedent that this case presents, and that firstly slaves in the 1850s didn't own property. And secondly, slaves, because of their servitude, could not seek legal redress in court. And so there were all kinds of challenges, but there was an inherent moral question about Harvard perpetuating unknowingly false narrative, profiting from it, and refusing to tell the true history about who this man was in disputing Louis Agassiz's his science. And so what, you know, firstly, I was blessed to convince Attorney Ben Crump that this is a case worth, that merited his attention. And he was also able to convince another attorney here in Connecticut, Michael Koskoff, who is another giant in the legal field. You know, what's unique about these two attorneys is I call them giant killers, in the sense that they're the David and Goliath type attorneys who like to take on the insurmountable cases and argue the moral issues. And so Attorney Crump and Attorney Koskoff happened to both be on the scene of the film Marshall, which Attorney Koskoff wrote. And Attorney Crump talked to Michael Koskoff about the case, and they both were at that point pretty much sold, but had to sell it to their partnership. But basically the legal issue of the case, and Harvard likes to spin this as well, I liken it to an incident of robbery, or the theft of property, meaning not only their dignity, but their image, their person. Renty and Dehlia weren't willing participants in the taking of these images. Dehlia is actually crying. She has a tear in her eye during the taking of these images. So we can demonstrate that these images were taken through the force of slavery, through the violence of slavery, that they're the outgrowth of slavery. And that that perpetrators of crimes in the history of our jurisprudence have never been granted the right to the property or the proceeds of that crime. And so we're talking about when you force people to strip and pose for images that will be used to demonstrate a proposed or an alleged inferiority, that was a crime. And at that time, when this happened, slavery had been abolished in the state of Massachusetts. Slavery had been abolished in many states. So, you know, it's not a simple question of a photographer taking a picture and owning the rights to the picture. I would argue that if a photographer put a gun to someone's head and say, you strip and allow me to take your photos, no court in this country would allow that photographer to keep those images. And that's our argument in a nutshell. But then we move on to the question of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, which, you know, as I've already said, we all know has never ended. It's just evolved and just assumed new names. But the Civil Rights Act and the 13th and 14th Amendment are important here because firstly, the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment have retroactive powers. And we found case law that supports that, that even though the Civil Rights Act and the 13th and 14th Amendment came after the photographs were taken, the law still protected the slaves. The law still says that these slaves have a right to seek redress, and that extends retroactively, that these slaves have a right to equal protection. And so I can show through other case law that our country has bent over backwards to atone for the sins, not only of our country, but for other countries. And they've gone out of their way. And the picture before you is a picture of Dehlia, Renty's daughter, which would be my third generation aunt, my great, great, great aunt. And Adele, I'm not exactly sure what Adele's last name is. I think it's Blackbauer. But at any rate, the reason why I put these two pictures together is the stories mirror each other exactly. Adele was an Austrian-born woman. She had a niece, Maria Altman, who fled to the United States in the 1930s because of the aggression that was going on in Austria, and her family were victims of the Holocaust. She fled to the United States and learned that her aunt, Adele, was hailed as the Mona Lisa of Austria, and that the Austrian government, this image of Adele was freebooted by the Nazis because of the Holocaust. And it was now she was the national heroine, and her picture was displayed in the Belvedere Museum in Austria. When Maria learned of this, she said, that's an image of my aunt, that's my aunt's picture, I want it back. She had no success in Austria, but she had great success here in the United States. Her case was actually heard at the United States Supreme Court. And ultimately, Maria Altman regained she recovered the image of her aunt from the Austrian government. But what happened thereafter is amazing, in that the United States government and lawmakers within, particularly my lawmaker, one of my US senators, sponsored legislation to protect the relics of the Holocaust. Not only to protect them, but that museums and other art dealers or whoever was in possession of art, they had to canvass their inventory and make sure that they didn't have Holocaust looted art. And then if they did, they were charged to do everything in their power to find those descendants and return the property. And I think that that's absolutely a necessary measure, one small measure, to repair the harm caused by the Holocaust. But my issue is, where is that same justice for Dehlia? Why can't she have that equal protection? Where is legislation that protects the relics of slavery? So, I talk about this because the question of whether the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, if this country has ever lived up to that promise, and I would argue it hasn't. And I link that to the Great Awakening that we're now experiencing, that we're now witnessing, where people all over this country and all over the world are suddenly coming to not only the understanding, but the position that Black lives matter, that Black people in this country, and not only in this country, all over the world, have suffered injustices throughout the history of this country, and that's never been addressed. So, it's fitting that we're having this conversation because, as my daughter said earlier, this is the best time to talk about, things that we've been told, that we've been promised, that we know are lies. like the 13th Amendment did not free the slaves. We know that. We have to talk about that. The 14th Amendment that guarantees Blacks equal access to courts and the right to petition the courts and equal protection under the law. We know that justice looks different for people of color, and we have to speak on it. We have to speak out against it and demand reform and demand change. So that's what my lawsuit is about. It challenges the 13th and 14th Amendment. If they say that Renty and Dehlia don't have rights, then say that the 13th and 14th Amendment is a lie, and I'll accept that. But as long as you're saying that the law allows these things, then we have to insist, and I insist, that they have the protections as promised by the law.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lanier. It's always such a pleasure to hear you talk about this journey you've been through. And our lawsuit as well talks at great length about why the 13th Amendment didn't really abolish slavery. And that's actually a very common myth that people tell themselves to make themselves feel better about the world that they live in. But I do want to hear from Jarrett. You're a student in the anthropology department, which is the same department actually who's keeping the possession of the daguerreotypes. I'm wondering, how did that connection influence your decision to engage in litigation against Harvard?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. And I just, before I answer it, I also want to echo your appreciation for you, Tamara, and sharing your story. I know it's not easy. And I see you, I see Dehlia, I see Renty, I see Shonrael, and I thank you for that. So what's wild is that the daguerreotypes are currently being held captive by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. This is the museum that is institutionally connected to the anthropology department. My first class at Harvard took place in the Peabody Museum. Everybody who comes through the PhD program in anthropology, your first class in the Peabody Museum, room 12. So when I read the first news story that someone was suing Harvard for images of enslaved ancestors that were at the Peabody Museum, I damn near passed out. Like I both from rage partially, but then also from joy that someone was telling them, similar to the people in the images, no. In regards to the lawsuit that we as the Prison Divestment Campaign have filed against Harvard, we absolutely took cues in terms of courage, strategy from the Lanier lawsuit. And in particular, I shared a link to the full lawsuit for everyone to read, and you really should read it, because I honestly have not read many legal documents like it. It is part testimony, part testament, and in terms of, I didn't have a hand in drafting the language of our lawsuit. That credit goes to Amanda and others in the law school. But the ways that, the parts that I did have a hand in the different times where I've spoken about the lawsuit, I've drawn inspiration from you, Tamara, and how you all have crafted the language and really emphasizing. So for those who don't know about some of the basics of our lawsuit, we're basically suing Harvard because it has chosen to, similar to their engagement with Ms. Lanier, just ignore and dismiss us. Because when Black people make particular claims in public, they go unheard. So they asked the court to make them hear us. And one of the major points of our lawsuit is that we, as donors to the university, so all plaintiffs in our lawsuit gave money to Harvard. I gave $12.24. I would have given less, but the minimum is $10. So I gave $12.24. Shout out, rest in peace to Kobe and Gianna Bryant. So I gave $12.24. I have a standing as a donor, but one of the things I've learned the most from Ms. Lanier's lawsuit is that I also have the moral standing. All of us as plaintiffs have a moral standing. And typically the courts laugh in the face of moral standing. That's not something that's not a language that registers to them. But just because that language doesn't register to them doesn't mean I'm not going to say it to them. And it doesn't mean that I, as a descendant of enslaved people in this country, is not going to say it. I am going to say it. And September 29th, they're going to have to hear it at our oral arguments. More on that a little bit later. But yeah, so that's kind of, so since I first heard about this lawsuit when it got filed in March 2019, I honestly, one of the other things I should say is that I used to be an archivist for a number of years. Shout out to the archivists who I know who are here today. I was like, they really got the wrong one. Like, I'm in this department, I'm an archivist. I learned as much about archives from reading Ms. Lanier's story as anything that I learned in library school. And so I've put every archival anthropological tool that I can manage towards amplifying this. And yeah, so that's kind of how it's helped frame my approach and the approach of my fellow plaintiffs in our lawsuit.
Thank you for that, Jared. And I would like to remind the audience at this moment that we will be taking questions at the end. So please drop your questions in the chat so that I can take note of them and possibly choose it later for the panelists. And to sharpen the point that Jared just made about our lawsuit, it's actually kind of interesting. So Harvard has hired 2 different sets of lawyers for Ms. Lanier and for our lawsuit. And sometimes the lawyers are saying contradictory things, in my opinion. For example, the Harvard lawyers who are speaking out, who are representing Harvard against Ms. Lanier said, oh, legally, we don't have to give our daguerreotypes to Ms. Lanier. But of course, we would love to include her in the ethical stewardship of this historical artifact. We would love to. So then I was thinking in my lawsuit, like, okay, so we're suing Harvard for mistreating Ms. Lanier and for investing in the modern prison industrial complex, which is basically slavery. Why is it that you have said that you believe that ethical stewardship includes Ms. Lanier, and yet you have not included her? So I'm really interested in hearing how they resolve that contradiction come September 29th, which is the date of our oral argument, which will be on Zoom, actually. So anyone here who is interested in attending definitely should attend, and we will be coming out with details later. So my next question is for Shonrael. Your mother has gone through such a journey in researching and getting all the documents and interviews and everything, and tracing her lineage back to Papa Renty. Where were you during this journey, and how did it affect you, and what did you learn about how Harvard's role in the world as a result of it?
So I can say that I also see a question in the chat that kind of falls in line with this. So Papa Renty was a household name. And so I would like to explain that this started with my grandmother. So my mother's mother, Maddie Pearl Thompson Lanier. And my grandmother treated our family history like nobody's business. She was the orator in our family. She was the keeper of the stories. There wasn't an opportunity that passed that, you know, she wasn't passing down or telling us a story about Papa Renty or other relatives around that time. The fact that we listened, though, I think is what's different, is that this has been an ongoing project. So one of her biggest things that she used to always tell us growing up was, you have to know your history. You have to know where you come from. And so that was huge. And family has always been very, very important for us. So maintaining that connection to family meant we needed to know where we came from. So we had these stories of my Papa Renty from my childhood, from my mother's childhood, from things that, like when I first saw the picture of Papa Renty, I was floored. You could not tell me that man was not 6 feet tall, 300 pounds. Like in my mind's eye, he was a giant, the way she described that he was like raging against the machine, getting dictionaries, teaching people how to read, holding secret church, like all of these little family story history lessons that we had that you know, that our stubbornness and our determination and our grit and our will come from that side of our family, that, you know, we were never, you know, junk takers. You know, we were always about action and about, you know, facilitating change and pushing change along. And that was a family trait that we inherited. I did a 5th grade project on
You were in 4th grade.
Fourth grade. In 4th grade, I had a project. It was a real simple project, but we don't do simple things here with the so it was supposed to be just a family tree project. And so it turned into me writing a book to provide to my teacher that literally took us back to Papa Renty and to his mom and to our migration and the change in our family name. My grandmother made it a strong point to tell us always that we were originally Taylors before we were Thompsons, and about the transition of Thompson to Taylor, where we were from, where these places were. So we had names of relatives in our head, like we had names, we had locations, we had places, we had context to stories where we knew that he had taught himself how to read using the Blueback Webster, which was the original speller brought about by Noah Webster. And just so happens that the Taylor plantation had often hosted Noah Webster, so he would have had access to that. But these are stories that we had well before knowing anything about the Taylor family, well before knowing anything about Louis Aguizi, well before even knowing there was any type of connection to Harvard University. We had this background and this knowledge just over the oral traditions of our family and passing these things down. So when it came to my grandmother's death, we had already been in the progress of doing a better job in documenting our story and finding our genealogical records, and having her with us throughout that journey made it so much easier to be able to say, you know, or to recall even stories where she had likened names to places that we could then see in the census and records and slave schedules to say, okay, well, our family stayed together for the most part, in terms of the family names and the people that she had told us stories about. So it made it a lot easier. I say that we are extremely blessed and abundantly blessed for that, because not everybody has that. We also knew kind of a guide of where to look, because we knew that they had started in South Carolina and the Carolinas, then had went out to Alabama. So we had that as a guider. So while my mom was getting all of the information together, and we always say this was a journey guided by God. It couldn't have been anything else, because there's no way that all of these things came to place, especially knowing how difficult it is to track people's history. My grandmother had 2 different date of births and 2 different birth certificates. One of those listed her as a man. The other, you know, it just, there was no such thing as proper record keeping for people like us, because they didn't care about us. You know, we were property, and they actually kept better records of us on slave schedules than they did in the census at times. So while she was doing that, I'm the internet geek. So I was on the computer trying to research. I was on ancestry.com looking for the little leafs, as taking those leafs as far as we could go. And that's where we found Sasha. I started Googling Papa Renty and looking at Renty, and that's how we found out about Louis Aguizi and Aguizi Horn and Switzerland, and that whole connection there was through Sasha. And we found her online because she had started a petition. I said, Ma, there's a petition to rename a mountain after Papa Renty, and it's in Switzerland. And we're like, all right, let's figure out who she is. Took a wing and a prayer, hopped on Facebook and started messaging her and said, you know, we followed your research. We found this information. Is there anything that you can do to help us? Do you have any other information on Renty? And started working collaboratively with her. We had another blessing where I just so happened to, one of my coworkers knew Chris Childs from the Boston Genealogical Association. We told her about our story and about how we were looking for information. And, you know, at that point we had gotten as far as we could as laymen at that point, you know, in pulling information as much as we could. And Harvard at that point, even back then, this was in the early days of the research. So this was probably about 2012.
Yeah,
No, 13. right around there. And we had already been in communication with Harvard to say, hey, I didn't know if you guys knew, but look, this is our grandfather. Like, we were super excited, like, hey guys, check this out. Had no idea that it was going to be controversial, had no idea that it was going to get the kind of blowback that we got, because we were just simply saying, hey, tell a story. Like, my grandmother told me about this man. I know who he was. Y'all should know who he is too. And especially understanding that someone was trying to use his photograph to justify the complete opposite of what this man embodied was frustrating. But we just had the understanding that Harvard must not have known. So, hey, come on board, let's work together and let's tell his story. And Harvard was like, nah, that's all right, we're good with that. We're just gonna take our money and keep trucking. So we doubled down and we got in touch with some real heavy hitter genealogists, because they weren't respecting the slave schedules or the census data or any connection to our oral history, which, you know, is very prominent within the African-American culture. That's what, to be honest with you, they made it that way. That's all we had left. So we went to Chris Childs. Chris Childs went to the Mormons, you know, that hold a lot of details on genealogical records, and he dug and he dug and he found even more data that connected us directly to Papa Renty, that went to speak to not even just us, but then Dehlia. And then we started finding even their children. We found Ophelia. We found a lot of our other members, family members, not just Papa Renty in this. So, you know, it was prominent because we want this man's story to be told. And, you know, the fight has always been, tell the truth. Okay, you had these images commissioned. You were about your paper back then, Harvard. You wanted to make sure that people wanted slavery around. You were knee deep, and all your money was connected to textiles. So, you know, Harvard and the big money back then was not about not having slavery. Why? When you had already, why increase the cost of cotton when you're a textile and all your money comes from textiles? So we understand why it was important for Harvard to promote some type of botched up race-based science to make Black people inferior, to justify slavery, to make it easier for their business to keep making good money. We get that, but we're saying now in this day and age, you should be able to come forward and say, we messed up back then. Hey, Laniers, this is your Papa Renty. We're gonna do right by you. We're gonna tell his story. We're gonna do right by this man, if only for the publicity around it. But they double down and continue to double down to this day and have the audacity to say that they are the gatekeeper and the ethical stewards of my grandfather's picture, that they don't even know, they refuse to own any part of his story. They refuse to own any part of their own story in promoting and benefiting from slavery. So we have a problem with that. And it seems real common sense to say, we're sorry, give the family their pictures. Like, who are you, Harvard? And that's my constant question is, who are you, Harvard? Like, especially in today's day and age, how is it impossible to hold these organizations accountable? You're tearing down monuments of Robert E. Lee across the country and these no-name Confederate people from all over the place, but we can't hold institutions like Harvard accountable for doing things with Black bodies and promoting race-based botched up science when you're supposed to be the #1 most prestigious flagship of education of the world, and you can't do right over these images. I think it's absolutely sad, but we do need people's help. And but I think I'll answer the question. I'm sorry, I get off on it.
So something that both of our lawsuits discuss at length actually is this statement that Harvard President Drew Faust released in 2016, called Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. And it was basically Harvard acknowledging, like, oh yes, like Harvard had something to do with slavery. And we're gonna try to be better about it in the future. And that was around the time that there was a lot of controversy around the Harvard Law School crest or shield, because it had featured bales of wheat.
Yes.
Because the original family that donated money to Harvard Law School to start the school was a very vicious slave owning family. And your attorney in the legal document points out that, I mean, how nonsensical it is that 2016, Harvard promised to do better by descendants of slaves and yet is treating Miss Lanier this way. And I know, Miss Lanier, you have told me that some people have been quite aghast that you would dare challenge the most powerful university in the world in this way. I want to ask this of all the panelists, like, what is inspiring you during this fight? What is motivating you to move forward, knowing that what you're doing is very much an uphill battle?
Well,
Ms.
I
Lanier,
think,
if you want to go first.
I am motivated and driven, firstly, by a promise that I made to my mother, and secondly, that the images and the false narrative that's out there disparages Renty in a way that offends not only me, but Renty's legacy, my mother's legacy, my family's legacy. So I feel my fighting with Harvard is motivated, is driven by, I feel attacked. I feel like our legacy is attacked, our family legacy is attacked. And I know that there is some part of my mother, wherever she is, that's saying, you have to right this wrong. You have to correct this, because Shonrael alluded to it a little earlier, but my mother, when she would talk about her enslaved ancestors, she spoke with such reverence. There was no shame in slavery to her, and there was no shame in what her ancestors had endured, and if anything, there was this pride and reverence. And so for me to leave this false narrative unchallenged, I would do it. I'm doing a disservice to Renty, and I'm doing a disservice to my mother. So that's what drives me, because I think about how she would react if she saw the images and knew the circumstances of their origin. She would, I think, be excited to see the image, because she herself had never seen, only heard of Papa Renty. So I think just for her, in a sense, making eye contact with the man that she had heard so much about would have given her pleasure. But I think that would have quickly eroded when she learned about Harvard's role in this, and Louis Agassiz's intentions and the propaganda that these pictures were created for. And so I just feel like I have to, on behalf of my mother and on behalf of Renty, I have to right this wrong. And so that is what drives me.
Jared, do you have a response?
I do. What drives me is the debt that we owe to the people who were enslaved, the people who were kidnapped, sold, packaged as cargo, brought across the Atlantic Ocean. It's a debt that I was trying to bring up my notes to the book, Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman, because she has a very, very poignant passage that I wanted to read. And I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me. But she basically says that we, as the those of us living with the afterlives of slavery, right? She talks about the afterlives of slavery, including incarceration, including early death, including houselessness, all these other different systems. And she talks about our debt to them is to finish the promise of abolition, is to make right what the 13th Amendment with other legal measures fail to get right, what they continually get wrong. So to me, that's what I think about. I think about the debt that I owe. One of the things that's really wild about the ways that I've come to be so impassioned about this project is I went to the home of Tamara and Shonrael Lanier in April, and I remember when Shonrael showed me the book that she wrote when she was in elementary school. And I remember looking through other family documents that they had preserved. And I don't know if y'all remember this. I remember looking through there and seeing names of my, like common surnames of people in my family. You know what I'm saying? And like, so when I see them fighting for their family images, like that's a fight for my family images. You know what I'm saying? Like this is connected. Like, it's not to say that like all Black people were related, but all Black people were, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, this is what this is what drives me. I think of the people on these ships. I think about the people who jumped off of the ships. I think about the people who ran away. I think about the people who poisoned enslavers. Shout out to them. I hope that they're, having a great day where they are. I just think about all of these people. I think about the people who are organizing prison strikes. I think about the people like Assata Shakur, who ran away from prison. I'm thinking of this sort of long debt that that I, as a Black person inheriting these struggles, have to stand. And to be at a place like Harvard, which I so frequently say, fuck Harvard, and I mean it. I want to say that here on the record too, fuck Harvard, truly. But also, I'm not going to allow my time at this university to go past without bringing forward the things that need to be brought forward, the things that they don't want to acknowledge. So that's what keeps me going. And having a group like the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign and many wonderful people I've met in this space give me energy. Young and old people from many different backgrounds.
Shonrael, did you want to make a statement?
I can't stand by anybody not doing right. I think we were hardcore raised in shame the devil, tell the truth. This is a lie. You are perpetuating a lie. You had a part of it. Do right. There's a whole healing process associated with this. You've caused harm. And what do you do as just a normal, regular human being when you cause harm, let alone a major influential institution? But if you've done wrong, it is on you not to figure out how to prove you didn't do wrong, but to make it right. Yeah. And that's what America in a whole has to do. This country has done wrong by Black people. Make it right. It's not that difficult. It's not. I mean, it's basic human rights type stuff, family. You can't take an image of someone. It would be like me going up to any jacker, anybody out in the street and taking an image for, running up on them with a gun, taking a picture of them, and then creating this whole false narrative around it, and then running with it, right? I'd get arrested. I'd have all types of lawsuits against me in today's day and age. What's wrong is wrong.
And we have a moral obligation to challenge not only Harvard, but all the institutions, all the universities that are engaging in this similar type of conduct, where they know that their origins are directly tied to slavery, and they remain silent about it. And they try to suppress conversations like Harvard has had. And Jared, I want to say he wrote an amazing editorial that I don't think the Crimson ran, and then you posted it somewhere else, but he talks about, I visited Harvard. I was interviewed by the editors and reporters with the Crimson. I spent the entire day there. And then I got an email from the editors saying, because of the concerns raised by the Peabody, I can't run your story. And so when I talk about not only the complicity in promoting slavery, but then to cover up, the cover up sometimes is worse than the crime. And that's what I feel like we are enduring now. This is a part of an attempt to cover up or to silence the discussion about Harvard's complicity with slavery. And anyone who speaks out against them is retaliated against in some way. And that has to be exposed. And we have to shame them, firstly, for what they've done, and hopefully as a motivator to do the right thing.
Thank you so much. That concludes the questions that I had. One of the audience questions that stuck out to me was, and I don't know the answer to this, so I'm interested in hearing the variety of opinions. Why go through this mess? Why go through this fight? Why not just do the right thing? Why is Harvard treating all of us this way?
I think that there is, and this is only my theory, but I believe that there's a lot of truth behind this. And if you think about a case that firstly is going to challenge not only institutions like Harvard and other universities, but museums and other institutions that have appropriated work. and not thinking about, and then my question is, if we look at Harvard, where is your wealth coming from? Other than we understand the investment in the prison industrial complex, but most universities are directly tied to appropriated work. So here it is, here in this case raises the question of, you have appropriated work that doesn't belong to you, and we're demanding you give it back. The precedence of such a case, I think, scares many people, because many people, their wealth is directly related to appropriated work. And you see in countries like in Benin, where you have the French government says, we're going to repatriate, we're going to return this looted art, this appropriated work to its place of origin. Not only are we going to return it, we're not going to argue that we're the ethical stewards of this property because we can afford to better care for it, but we're going to return it and enable the recipients the resources to provide the kind of care that these artifacts need. So when you think about the transition of wealth that such a case may bring about, I think for universities like Harvard, any acknowledgement or any concession threatens their wealth in a way that they would have to then, it opens Pandora's box that I think that they would much rather stay closed, because not only is it the daguerreotypes, but what is it else, Harvard, that you're sitting on, that you've appropriated, that you don't have the right to own, and that you will have to give back.
Down to the land that university is sitting on belongs to somebody else at some point.
Yeah, so I think those are questions that I think my opinion is, if they concede 1 inch to me, it opens the door where we could look at their wealth, where it came from, and maybe have to return other things.
I absolutely agree with you, Mom. And I think that I also agree with Rachel and James in the comments. They brought up the Killmonger scene from the Black Panther movie, where he was at the... That is her favorite line. Like that, if she could just replay one part of the movie, it's that right there. You should have seen her when we first saw that in a movie theater. That's it right there. But I agree, it opens the door to so much else.
Yes.
And I think that this is so tied to reparations. You know, reparations is such a dirty word, you know, and how do you truly repair the damage that America has done without reparations?
First admit you've done harm.
Exactly. But so you can't admit that you've done any harm. You got to hide your head in the sand. You have to find a way to deny, and dismiss. And so effectively, Harvard has told everybody that's suing them at this point, both the Harvard Prison Divestment, you guys, as well as us, that we have no claims. That these are nuisance lawsuits, basically, that they're unfounded, they have no relevance. That's their response, is dismiss, not own any part of the wrongdoing, not acknowledge any of the factual evidence put forward. That would be too dangerous. Deny, deflect, and try to dismiss. And I think that they got the right lawyers to do it with the people that they've represented in the past. So I think that's gonna just be it. You give an inch. And anything regarding reparations, and the United States has done wrong to so many, you open that door. That's why we're okay with giving, doing things for people that we weren't directly involved in the harm of. So and arguing for reparations for people from the Holocaust, but not for anybody that was in an internment camp here in the United States. So it's
Thank you. That. Jarrett, there's another question in the chat, so that I would like the panelists to address. So if you could talk about what Harvard is protecting, and also how people, our supporters, can show up for us in the future.
Yeah, I'll answer the second one first. So we, as I mentioned earlier, we have oral arguments. We as the plaintiffs filing suit for the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. We have oral arguments on September 29th. It will be on Zoom. We will find a way to protect our constitutionally assured right for that to be public. So stay tuned to our social media channels for that. We're also going to have a month of events leading up to it, including conversations with organizers, working with folks in San Quentin who are being exposed to COVID in ridiculous conditions as any cage across the country. So there's going to be a number of events that we have leading up to this, including hopefully our rescheduled event with no name. But the first part about like what is Harvard protecting? It's protecting whiteness. That's number one. There's nothing that Black people can say or a way in which Black people can say it that an institution like Harvard will feel bound to respect or listen to. That doesn't mean we don't say it, but it's just to state that, for the record, this is a protection of whiteness. I want to lift up something that Krisa mentioned in the comments about other items that the Peabody Museum owns. I think in particular she referenced something from Benin, but the Peabody Museum has looted all kinds of stuff from all corners of the planet. The very, very long essay that I have under peer review takes a close look at some of the first items that the Peabody ever collected in the 1860s when it was created. It tries to chart the history of the Peabody as a place where non-white people's remains have been taken and stowed and to be studied for research. And that's deplorable. And they know it. So it wouldn't just be Harvard that comes under scrutiny. Then, like someone said, you have to look at the British Museum. You will have to look at the Louvre, right? When I went to Paris last year and I tweeted something about the Louvre, I'm like, yeah, look at all of the shit that we like have stolen over the years. Like that's what Louvre stands for. Look at all of the stuff that we've like, taken from virtually everywhere. That all of those things would have to be under review. The floodgates would literally and metaphorically be open for people to come. And I just really want to state again something that Ms. Lanier mentioned earlier. And I think James mentioned this in the comments. It should, like, if Harvard is saying is as Shonrael put it, denying, deflecting, and trying to dismiss, then they should go out and say, like, okay, well, who are the descendants of Renty and Dehlia? If you're saying that the Laniers are not their descendants, then who are their descendants? Because from my archivist eyes, everything I've seen is beyond a shadow of a doubt that they descend from Renty and Dehlia. So the burden should be on Harvard to show otherwise, but they are unwilling to, because it would literally cause so many museums and archives to collapse, because so many of those institutions have been built on taking shit from Black people, and from Indigenous people, and from Black Indigenous people, and from other non-white people all over the world.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that my genealogy has been certified, and this genealogist is the person who did Michelle Obama's genealogy. Chris Childs, Shani, my daughter mentioned earlier, he did President Obama's genealogy. And the Tony Carrier, who I worked with, did Michelle Obama's. But my genealogy has been certified in that I meet and far exceed any legal standard to prove kinship. So it's not a legal question as to whether or not. And Harvard has finally stopped saying that, and now they're saying they're the ethical stewards of the property. But, again, we have to look at, the precedents this case will set, not only for Harvard, for Yale, and other power institutions, but institutions, even the Wall Street. And just the appropriated work that people have just commandeered. And now, if we're successful, we'll have to return. And so it can really demonstrate a transference of wealth, which scares people. And I think that's at the heart of Harvard's resistance. I think they see the big picture, and this is why they're going to fight it kicking and screaming as far as they possibly can, because I think that this case has huge implications for the underlying question of Harvard. Where do you get your wealth, and how have you acquired your wealth?
And Ms. Lanier, do you want to comment on how people who want to support you can do so?
What I tell people is share the story, because as I've said a little earlier, silence about this case works to Harvard's advantage. They don't want people to know. They don't want their alumni. If you know alumni, let them know what Harvard has done in terms of their complicity with slavery and how they try now to reframe the narrative. And Amanda talked a little earlier about in 2016, where Dr. Drew Fowle, she brought in John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, for that event, but she made sure that I was not permitted to go to that event. And so, but just publicly shaming and exposing Harvard for what they've done, share the story, tell the story. There are many who still don't know, and there are many who hold Harvard in such high esteem because they're Harvard, first of all, but secondly, because they don't know the extent to the harm that they've caused to get to that place of prestige. So we have to expose Harvard for the shameful things that they've done in their history, that they've never atoned for, that they've never accounted for. And I also want to add that every time Harvard gets called on the carpet about their ties to slavery, they've done it 3 times that I know of. In 2006 and 7, between 2006 and 7, Harvard rebooted this discussion about slavery. They encouraged students to do investigations about Harvard's ties. The students did a lot of comprehensive work to unearth Harvard's ties to slavery. When the heat was off and when the cameras were gone, Harvard quickly suppressed and buried that information. Then again in 2016, this issue arose. Harvard put a plaque on, it was a Wadsworth or somewhere, and what we're going to do to atone and to have honest conversations about slavery. They had that conference in 2017 where they live streamed all over the world to talk about reparations, where they didn't talk about reparations.
And they used Papa Renty's picture.
And they used
on the pamphlet and had it blown up on this big, huge screen that was hanging above the auditorium stage. Like, and at no point did they say anything about his story, who he was.
What they said was invisible when they knew his history. And then again, recently, when this case and when the lawsuit surfaced, they're investing millions into exploring their ties to history. So they keep rebooting this process every time there is media attention that attempts to expose Harvard's ties to slavery. And you know, it's just, as Shonrael said, an opportunity to deflect and distract and to dismiss the attention that they've been given because of their history, and they've never honestly dealt with it in any meaningful way.
Thank you so much. So for our closing comments, I mean, I wish we could talk for hours on end. There's just so much to say about this topic, but for closing comments, I will encourage everyone to please get updates about these lawsuits via social media. Shonrael posted facebook.com/freerenty. We're on, the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign is on social media at Harvard PDC. And you can also email us, harvardpdc@gmail.com. And we will be having a month of programming in September leading up to oral argument. So I hope you can tune in to both our oral argument and Ms. Lanier's as well. So thank you so much.
Share. Sharing is caring is what my daughter often says.
Thank you so much to everyone who joined us for this conversation. And a huge thank you to the panelists for being brave enough to speak out against this injustice that Harvard is perpetuating upon the world. And I mean, they're doing the work to make Harvard move slightly more towards the right side of history. So I'm just so grateful for your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Much appreciated.
Take care, cousin.
Peace.